Dear writer, you need to quit. This is the show that helps you know what to quit, what to keep, and what to question. My name is Becca Syme. I'm a Gallup certified strengths coach with thousands of hours coaching 6 and 7-figure authors, mid-listers, major award winners, and new authors alike. Because everyone needs to quit something. Anyone can tell you what worked for them. And of course they say it might not work for you, but they can't tell you why. I can tell you why. Welcome to the QuitCast. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the QuitCast. This is episode number 7, and it's going to be a keepcast on our Strengths for Writers theme. Today, we're going to be talking about empathy. So out of what to quit, what to keep, and what to question, if you have high empathy, this is going to be a show you want to pay attention to. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to turn it over to Terry and Becca, and we are going to talk about what the theme of empathy looks like. Take it away, Terry and Becca.
So people with high empathy with this theme can sense other people's feelings. And they add this by imagining themselves in others' lives or situations. But I don't always find that to be true. Like, not all empathy people are feeling the feelings because they're consciously placing themselves in the other person's shoes. So it's part of it, but it's not the whole core. But the core is you sense emotions from people around you. You can feel what other people are feeling. And for some empathy people, they feel it as though the emotions are actually their emotions. And so, like, if you have very high empathy, for instance, it's not uncommon to walk into a room and be sitting next to someone and they're feeling something and you feel it and you don't realize for a second that you're feeling what they feel and not because of an impetus from yourself. So
Right. And that's weird because what you just described, I get that. I feel that a lot.
yeah,
But my scores, I'm only a 10.
but
And I
that's
know the
still
10,
high.
right. But I would
Like,
expect that from like a 2 or 3, but I do get that. Writing, it's very important, empathy, to write with empathy, or for your audience when those readers say, "Oh my God, I felt like I was that person," right? That's because they've got empathy.
they have a very wide emotional vocabulary because they've had to learn how to name emotions and how to know how to talk about emotions, because emotions are just such a big part of their life. And so they tend to be very easy with describing how things feel. The interesting piece, and almost every really high empathy I've coached is like this, they can't always tell you, like, slow it down. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but like if you're sitting and writing a scene and a character feels something and you don't put it on the page sometimes as a high empathy because you just feel it by reading the words. You're like, and then
Right.
he slumped his shoulders, and you feel that sense of despair.
Right.
Not everybody can do that.
One of the things I worry about is that when I have a good scene that I feel I'm almost always say that I can't get that on the paper. That as emotional as it was, I'm always thinking that it doesn't work. I remember one of the books I wrote, I told you about that one scene, and you said it was good, but I'm always thinking there's no way I can convey that. And like you said, you try to do it in the show, but it doesn't always work. But
Yeah.
yeah, so when you
Because
can
the
do it, you can do
emotion
it.
for
But
you
he,
is so real. Like,
right,
you feel it and it's so real, and it feels like, how could I possibly describe what that feels like
right.
so that people will feel it? But you do. I mean, and I
But they
read
do,
that scene and I cried,
and
right?
right, and they do have a wider vocabulary, so they can
Yes.
communicate those emotions better than the average person, which is good.
So a lot of super high empathy writers, and interestingly, it does not matter if you're male or female, because I've coached number 1 and number 2 empathy writers who are both male and female, and it's the same exact thing between both. But a lot of high empathy people will have a very difficult time when emotions are high outside of their control.
Mm,
So,
yeah,
like, getting into when author fights happen online,
yep,
or when
yep,
something really crazy happens in life, they will often feel like they're overwhelmed by emotion, and then they can't work because it's so difficult for them. And it's not something that you can prepare for, because sometimes it just sort of assaults you, like it happens and you don't expect it. And then high empathy people will wonder, like, well, why can't I just turn this off? And it's like, because you're actually feeling all of the things that all these people feel. And so a lot of high empathy people, what I tell them is like, turn it off, like turn everything off. Just don't engage, because it's not your responsibility to feel other people's feelings. And that's hard.
So today I have a couple of very high empathy authors with me. The first is Jill Neal. And if best-selling author Jillian Neal's ever been around you, she's probably crafted an entire backstory for you, complete with a happily ever after. She writes romance, both cowboys and military heroes, and she wants to hear all of the stories. And of course, as a high empathy, and feel all of the feelings, right? She's written more than 20 novels, and she'll make you laugh, cry, swoon, and melt in every book that she writes. And that's Jillian Neal. And then we also have Debbie Herbert. And Debbie is a hybrid author who is a USA Today bestseller and a Publishers Weekly bestseller. She's published by Harlequin and also is currently under contract with Thomas and Mercer. She writes romantic suspense, paranormal romance, and psychological suspense, and is very high in empathy as well. And again, part of the desire of having both Jillian and Debbie on the podcast is to show that empathy isn't limited to just one genre. Empathy in writers is not limited by gender. It's not limited by age. We have plenty of high empathy men who take Write Better Faster or take Strengths for Writers. And so it's possible to have high empathy and write anywhere. But specifically, I want to talk with these women today about what it looks like to be a writer who is very, very talented in emotional bandwidth, in emotional vocabulary, in understanding emotional arcs and character depth. And so let's watch the Strengths Talk Show with Jillian Neal and Debbie Herbert.
I mean, honestly, when I first did the Strengths Finders test, and that was number one, and I told my husband, and he was like, well, that's not surprising.
Yeah.
I was one of the people that didn't really recognize it as a strength. And so once I kind of had a name for it, I guess, or, read a little bit about it and saw myself so much in it, I think I probably, in my writing, it allowed me to be okay doing things the way that I do them instead of the way that I thought you were supposed to do them. And, in my everyday life, it's something I've done my whole life. I feel all the things. I notice every glance. I notice the way your arm moves. I notice all of the things, and I'm able to, without really consciously thinking about it, I'm able to feel how you're feeling or whoever is around me. It also allows me to know when I need to a break from feeling all of the other people.
Yes.
So,
yes.
it was a big eye opener that shouldn't really have been an eye opener for me.
One, probably partly because it feels so natural. It's just
Right.
something that you do.
I've
And so
always
it's like,
done
well,
it, yes.
how is this a strength? And one of the things that we talk about a lot with empathy is being able to walk into a room or to sort of open Facebook and feel the tenor of how things are, like feel the emotions. Debbie, how is that for you? Do you feel like when you meet people or see people that you immediately can get a sense for how they're feeling?
I do, definitely. And I've always pretty much known I had high empathy, but I think a lot of times I operated from the basement of it, and people would say, or I would call myself overly sensitive. But I recognize now it's just me being able to read body language and just pick up on other people's feelings. And it's not a bad thing at all. It's a good thing.
It's a great thing. And it's a really great thing, given especially that both of you write romance, and you can use empathy obviously in any genre, and we'll talk about that, but specifically because romance is so much about emotional arc and about how characters emotionally connect with each other. Having empathy is a real strength in both of your books, I will say. So when you think about how your empathy works, and especially since you've been learning about the strength itself, how do you see the strength appear specifically, Jillian, in your books, or maybe your method of preparation for writing books?
I've taken on some pretty tough characters, and I am very character driven. So, when I want to tell the story, Natalie Camden was molested as a child, and I just wrote Maddie in my last book. Her husband was killed in Iraq, and she ends up falling in love with his best friend, and so that was an extremely emotional toil for both of them. The guilt of that, and so I think that my empathy allows me to really dig in and write stories of characters who have been through really tough things, and kind of feel like I've done them justice. And I feel, I get a lot of emails about Natalie from victims and how much the book helped them. And so that's really, for me, that's better than any list I could have hit, anything. So I do really lean into that ability to feel what other people are feeling, because it's probably not something that I lived, but there's a story there that I want to tell.
Yeah, and you can connect with the emotions. Like I've watched in some of your scene writing where the emotion has an arc that feels very realistic. And I think that's part of, we talk about this a lot in our strengths classes about why readers read and how they get invested. And we want them to not look up from the book, right? Like that's what we want. We want them to be invested.
Right.
And that reality of how emotions work is something that's resonant with people, even when they don't realize that it's so real, right? But that's part of what your empathy is able to do in those scenes where, especially when the emotion really arcs, it feels like it's something that I would believe really happened, because it's so much reality. And some of that is your capacity to have watched and understood so many people over the years, right? That you can really connect with that. So Debbie, talk to me for a second. Have you ever had an experience with writing your books where the empathy either that you have for your characters or for other people has impacted how you prepare for or write a book?
I would say yes, especially when I first started writing as a newbie. I think my empathy for my characters would make me avoid conflict. And that was the one thing I had to learn how to do, is to be mean to my characters, because I didn't want them to hurt. Yeah. And I also think my empathy has kept me from writing a couple stories. I did try to write a book once based on something tragic that had happened to one of my children. And I found I just could not write it. And it's one of the few times I've ever not finished a book. I just decided it was not worth it to me to go through that, to bring up all those emotions from the past again. So I had to let it go.
Yeah, and it can really make you pause, I think, when you don't know that that's where it's coming from. Like when you're not sure that the empathy is there. So you haven't taken the StrengthsFinder test. You don't know that you have this super high capacity to feel other people's emotions. And so what probably happened, I would assume, is that you just stopped writing. And it was like, what happened? And now do you feel like when you know that you have empathy, you're looking backwards and saying, oh,
well, of course I couldn't do that.
Yeah, of course I couldn't.
Why did I even try?
Right. Do you think you would choose not to write a book like that, not to even start now that you know this?
Yes, I would.
Yeah.
Because, my own mental health is more important than any one book. And there's plenty of stories out there without having to relive something from the past that's going to make me feel bad.
Oh, yeah, definitely. When I see this a lot with high empathy writers, where what they feel for even the characters will stop them from writing, because they're feeling so intensely about the way that a particular scene makes a character feel, that they'll actually be feeling those emotions themselves, and it will stop them from writing. I actually coached a writer who was in the middle of a conflict scene and had been stopped writing for almost a year and couldn't work through that conflict scene. And when I talked to her about it, and we were talking about what high empathy meant, and got to, this was an emotional set that she had a hard time feeling herself. And I was like, well, of course, this is taking you back to this time, etc. And she immediately stopped writing the book and started a new book and has written like 8 books since then. You know what I mean? So it's like,
right.
I think empathy can really be a part of how your life impacts you, in addition to how the actual characters are impacted by it, or how the readers might be impacted by it. So that's fascinating. Has empathy for other people around you ever stopped you? And Debbie, let's start with you. Has empathy for people around you ever stopped you from writing? Like, I sort of joke about this, about how author crises come up all the time in the world. So let's pretend, Debbie, that you get on Facebook in the morning and read about an author crisis. How likely, on a scale of 1 to 10, are you to be able to write for the rest of the day?
I would say probably about a 5. It would definitely affect me, and I would have to probably go for a walk or meditate or do something to get back in the zone of my writing. I do think one thing that helps me as I see writing is kind of escapism for me from problems. So that helps override some of that. But if I'm dealing with a personal crisis, it's very hard sometimes to get back in the groove.
But
When I often will tell empathy writers, high empathy writers, to write before they get onto social media, because once you let emotions in as a high empathy, they're not going away. Like, it takes so much work to get them out and to get them to go away. And it's not always a choice. This is something that I think is hard sometimes for people who haven't studied this strength of empathy to understand, is that it's not like you can just put a wall up. I mean, when you have an extremely high capacity for assimilating other people's emotions, it's sort of like it happens without you. I call empathy the emotional sponge writers. Like, they're the people who will just suck in all the emotions of everyone around them, and it's not something that's intentional, it just happens.
And before this course, I thought that was how everybody saw
everybody was.
Really?
Yeah, I had no idea. I thought everybody felt like I felt.
Did it boggle your mind to know that there are people who just don't even have the capacity to feel other people's feelings?
Yeah, I found it shocking.
Yeah.
So listening to these two writers talk really reminds me of how important it is to understand where you're strong. And so I want to put in a quick plug for taking the StrengthsFinder test, the Clifton Strengths Assessment, and understanding if this is something that you have a very high capacity in. And specifically the two women that I've had on this podcast, if you read their books, you see the empathy on the page, you feel it. They're so strong in that trait, and they're so good at it that it just comes across so clearly, and it bleeds on the page. And it's so cool because it happens both in Debbie's suspense, in her thrillers, and also in Jillian's romance. And so I want to encourage you, if you're thinking about, how do I stand out in the market? How do I get better at what I'm already doing? How do I lean into my strengths? Definitely step one is you've got to know what your strengths are. And you can absolutely do that on your own by self-assessment. I always encourage taking the StrengthsFinder because I feel like, why not utilize a tool that has so much research and science behind it? And I found it to be a very accurate experience in listening to what the actual strengths behaviors are and how to develop them. And so I hope that you will continue to want to learn more about what to keep, and specifically what to keep doing and how to get better at the stuff you should keep doing. And you can support this podcast for as little as $1 a month on Patreon, or just come and read the comments or read the posts that we're putting up and see what's going on. And I hope that you'll continue to come back and watch these podcasts and learn more about StrengthsFinder. I hope that you'll like, comment, subscribe, Please pass this video along to friends that you know have high empathy. Help them feel like they're not alone in this industry and like there are people out there who understand them. And next time on the QuitCast, we are going to be talking about quitting again. I know I promised we wouldn't talk about quitting all the time, but we haven't talked about quitting in a while. And so we're going to talk about quitting in the next podcast. And what should you quit? Well, I don't know. You're going to have to tune in to find out. So until next time, I'll see you in the next QuitCast.